In a cardboard box tucked beneath the rafters of an estate sale in rural Pennsylvania, a photograph lay forgotten among dozens of others. The year was 2019. The woman who discovered a tan antique dealer named Claire Hastings would later say she felt nothing unusual at first. It was a child's portrait, formal and posed, the kind taken in studios across America during the early 20th century. The child sat upright in a wooden chair, hands folded neatly in the lap. Wearing a white cotton dress with delicate embroidery along the collar, the backdrop was plain, the lighting soft. Everything about the image suggested innocence, tradition, and the careful preservation of memory. But as Claire examined the photograph more closely in the fading afternoon light, something shifted. She couldn't name it at first. The child's face was clear, the features well-defined. The eyes looked directly at the camera, as children were instructed to do. The mouth was closed, neutral, composed, and yet beneath the surface of that stillness, there was something else. A tension, a rigidity that felt less like obedience and more like restraint. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, were 3 words and a year. Eliza May, 1924. Claire had been dealing in antiques and vintage photographs for nearly 15 years. She had handled hundreds of portraits from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, images of stern-faced grandparents, solemn children in their Sunday best, young couples frozen in the amber of their wedding days. She knew the conventions of early photography, the long exposure times that demanded absolute stillness, the formal poses that reflected the solemnity of the occasion, the careful staging that turned ordinary people into timeless subjects. But this photograph felt different. It carried a weight that had nothing to do with age or rarity. That evening, Claire posted the image online, asking collectors and historians if anyone recognized the studio or the child. She included a description of where she had found it and the inscription on the back. Within hours, the responses began to arrive. Not with answers, but with questions. "Why does the child look so afraid?" one commenter wrote. Another asked, "Is this a post-mortem photograph?" The suggestion was unsettling but not impossible. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, families sometimes photographed their deceased children as a final act of memory, a way to preserve their image before burial. It was a practice born of grief, and the limitations of technology. Cameras were expensive, and most families had only one opportunity to capture their loved ones on film, yet this child's eyes were open. The posture, though stiff, showed no signs of the elaborate staging used in death portraits. There were no flowers arranged around the body, no visible supports holding the child upright. None of the telltale markers that experts use to identify post-mortem photography. This child was alive when the photograph was taken, but something about her presence suggested she was not entirely present, as if some essential part of her had already retreated to a place the camera could not reach. Still, the unease remained, spreading like a slow chill through everyone who looked at the image. A portrait historian from Vermont reached out privately, requesting a higher resolution scan. She wanted to examine the details more carefully, to apply the same forensic techniques used by art historians to authenticate paintings and photographs. Claire agreed, and within days, the photograph was digitized at a resolution far beyond what the naked eye could perceive. The scan captured every fiber of the paper, every grain of silver in the emulsion, every microscopic detail that had been invisible for nearly a century. What emerged from that scan would transform simple family portrait into something far darker. The child's expression, under magnification, revealed microtensions in the muscles around the eyes and mouth, subtle indicators of fear or distress that no amount of studio direction could fully mask. The gaze, once thought to be direct and obedient, now appeared fixed, not on the camera, but through it, as if the child were looking at something just beyond the lens, something only she could see. The hands folded so neatly in her lap showed faint pressure marks along the wrists, lines that suggested restraint or repeated confinement, and the dress, pristine in its construction, bore tiny irregularities along the hemsmall tiers, hastily mended, as if the garment had been worn hard and long before being prepared for this single, formal moment. The photography historian who had requested the scan studied it for 3 days before responding. When she finally wrote back, her message was brief but pointed. She had seen similar expressions in photographs from institutions, orphanages, asylums, reformatories, places where children were not cherished but controlled. She had seen the same rigidity in images of child laborers, factory workers too young to defend themselves, too exhausted to resist. But she had never seen it in a formal family portrait, a setting that was supposed to represent love, security, and pride. By the time the analysis was complete, Claire Hastings had stopped thinking of the photograph as a collectible. She began to wonder if what she held in her hands was not a memory at all, but a document, a record of something that had never been spoken aloud, a piece of evidence that had survived when everything else, every record, every voice that might have testified had disappeared into the silence of the past. And so the investigation began, not as a search for a name or a date, but as an attempt to answer a single, haunting question: what happened to Eliza May? The photograph offered no easy answers. It was a surface, smooth and impenetrable, hiding everything beneath. But surfaces can be cracked. Details can be extracted. And sometimes if you look long enough and carefully enough, the truth begins to emerge, not all at once, but in fragments. Like pieces of a shattered mirror slowly being reassembled, Claire reached out to genealogists, historians, and archivists across Pennsylvania. She contacted local historical societies, church archives, and county clerks. She posted the photograph in forums dedicated to genealogy and historical research, asking if anyone recognized the name or the face. The responses came slowly, but each one added a small piece to the puzzle. A census record here, a church registry there, a property deed, a newspaper clipping, fragments of a life that had been lived in the shadows, almost entirely forgotten. And as those fragments accumulated, a picture began to form, not of a happy childhood preserved in sepia tones, but of a girl who had been trapped, silenced, and erased. A girl whose only testimony was a single photograph, taken in a moment of stillness that might have been her only moment of visibility in a life, otherwise hidden from view. The investigation would take months. It would lead to abandoned houses, forgotten graves, and uncomfortable conversations with descendants who had inherited not just property and heirlooms, but secrets. It would uncover a story that no one wanted to tell, a story that had been deliberately buried beneath layers of time, shame, and silence. But it would also give Eliza May something she had never had in life: a voice, a presence, a chance to be seen, truly seen, not as a portrait of innocence carefully staged for the camera, but as a child who had suffered, endured, and survived long enough to leave behind this one fragile piece of evidence. And that evidence, once examined, once understood, would prove impossible to ignore. Asterisk, the inscription on the back of the photograph was simple, almost careless. Eliza May, 1924. No surname, no location, no studio mark. For a portrait of this quality, the absence of a photographer's imprint was unusual. Most studios in the 1920s stamped or embossed their work, a mark of pride and a form of advertisement. The photographer's name, the studio address, sometimes even a slogan, these were standard features of professional portraiture. But this image bore none of that. It existed without origin, without context, as if it had been deliberately separated from the world that created it. The handwriting itself offered few clues. It was small and cramped, written in pencil rather than ink, suggesting haste or informality. The letters were uneven, the pressure inconsistent, as if the writer had been uncertain or distracted. There was no flourish, no decorative script, just the bare minimum of information needed to identify the subject. It was the kind of inscription that might have been added years after the photograph was taken, by someone who had inherited the image, but knew little about the child it depicted. The first step was to search public records for children named Eliza May, born in or around the early 1920s. The name was not uncommon, particularly in rural areas of the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest, where traditional biblical and family names remained popular. Birth registries from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia yielded dozens of matches. But narrowing the search required more than a name. It required a location, a family, a thread that could be pulled without breaking. A genealogist named Thomas Brennan took up the case. He had spent 30 years tracing family histories, untangling the branches of immigrant families, tracking down lost relatives, and solving mysteries that had puzzled descendants for generations. He was meticulous, patient, and relentless, qualities that made him particularly well-suited for cases like this, cases where the evidence was scarce and the trail had gone cold decades ago. Brennan began with the photograph itself, examining every detail that might offer a clue. The style of the dress suggested modest means, well-made, but not wealthy. The fabric was simple cotton, the embroidery delicate but not elaborate. It was the kind of dress a working-class family might have saved for special occasions, washed and mended carefully, passed down from one child to another. The studio backdrop, though plain, showed signs of wear along the edges, indicating it had been used many times. The painted canvas was faded in spots, the seams visible where panels had been joined together. This was not a high-end portrait studio catering to the wealthy, but a small-town operation serving ordinary families who could afford a photograph only once or twice in a lifetime. The chair in which the child sat was a common style, mass-produced and sold through catalogs like Sears and Montgomery Ward. It was simple, functional, and unremarkable, the kind of furniture that appeared in thousands of photographs from the same era. None of these details pointed to a specific place, but together they painted a picture of a small-town studio, likely serving a working-class clientele in a rural or industrial community. Brennan cross-referenced birth records with census data from 1920. Looking for families with a daughter named Eliza May, would have been around 4 or 5 years old in 1924, he found 3 strong matches, all within a 100-mile radius of where the photograph had been discovered. One family lived in a coal mining town in western Pennsylvania, a place where men descended into the earth each morning and returned, if they returned at all, covered in dust and exhaustion. Another resided on a farm outside Harrisburg, a sprawling property that had been in the family for generations, worked by hand and horse until the land gave out. The third was listed in a boarding house in a small mill town called Riverton, a place where textile workers rented rooms by the week and families crowded into narrow spaces that smelled of damp wool and coal smoke. It was the third entry that caught his attention. The 1920 census listed a family of 4, a father named Jonathan, a mother named Ruth, an older son whose name was recorded as James, and a daughter named Eliza May, born in 1919. The father's occupation was listed as mill worker, a common designation in Riverton, where the cotton mill employed nearly half the town's population. The family lived at 14 Millbrook Lane, a boarding house address shared with 2 other families. By 1930, the family had vanished from the records entirely. No forwarding address, no death certificates, no mention in any subsequent census or directory. It was as if they had simply stopped existing, erased from history as completely as if they had never been born. Brennan had seen this before. Families moved frequently during the 1920s and 1930s, especially working-class families who followed jobs from town to town, factory to factory, mine to mill. Record-keeping in those years was inconsistent, but it was not unusual for families to slip through the cracks, their names absent from one census or another. But a complete disappearance, no records at all for any member of the family, was more troubling. It suggested either a deliberate effort to avoid documentation, or something darker. Brennan reached out to local historical societies in Riverton, asking if anyone remembered the family or had access to church records, school rosters, or burial registries. The responses were slow. Riverton had declined steadily since the mill closed in the 1950s, and many of its records had been lost, damaged, or simply thrown away when buildings were demolished or sold. But eventually, a volunteer archivist sent a scanned page from a Presbyterian church ledger. The entry was dated March 1924. It read, Eliza May baptized. Parents, Jonathan and Ruth. Address, 14 Millbrook Lane. The house number was the first tangible lead. Brennan located a property map from 1925 and found the address still standing. Though the structure had changed hands more than a dozen times in the intervening decades, the current owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Calloway, had lived there since 1978. When Brennan called her, she listened quietly to his questions. her silence stretching so long that he thought the line had gone dead. Then, finally, she spoke. "There used to be a room upstairs," she said slowly, as if choosing each word carefully, "that no one would use. The previous owner told me it was bad luck to sleep in it. I never asked why. I just kept the door closed." Brennan asked if he could see the room. Mrs. Calloway hesitated, then agreed, but with a condition. She would give him the key, but she would not go with him. She had not been inside that room in more than 20 years, and she had no intention of returning. When Brennan asked why, she said something that stayed with him long after the conversation ended. "'Cause," she said, "some places remember what happened in them, and that room remembers something terrible." The high-resolution scan revealed what the original photograph had kept hidden for nearly a century. Under magnification, the child's face became a map of tension, fear, and something deeper, something that no amount of studio posing or parental instruction could fully suppress. The eyes were the first point of focus. In standard portrait photography of the 1920s, subjects were instructed to look directly at the camera, holding their gaze steady for the duration of the exposure. Photographers often used phrases like "watch the birdie" to encourage children to focus, to hold still long enough for the image to be captured. But Eliza May's eyes, when enlarged dozens of times their original size, told a different story. The pupils were dilated, a physiological response to stress, fear, or low light. But the studio lighting in the photograph was adequate, consistent with typical portrait setups. The dilation, then, was more likely emotional than environmental. The muscles around the eyes, particularly the orbicularis oculi, the delicate ring of tissue responsible for closing the eyelids, showed signs of strain. These muscles, when tense, create fine lines and shadows that are invisible to the naked eye, but become apparent under magnification. The pattern was consistent with someone who had been crying or holding back tears. Someone who had been told to stop, to be still, to behave. The gaze itself, once thought to be calm and obedient, now appeared locked, almost frozen, as if the act of looking forward, of meeting the camera's unblinking lens, required every ounce of effort the child could muster. The mouth, too, revealed hidden tension. The lips were pressed together, not in a natural resting position, but in a way that suggested forced composure. The corners of the mouth, when examined closely, showed micro-expressions that psychologists associate with suppressed emotion grief. Perhaps a fear or a resigned acceptance that is even more troubling in a child. The lower lip was slightly fuller on one side, as if it had been bitten or pressed hard against the teeth. This was not the face of a child who was simply bored or tired during a long exposure. This was the face of a child who had learned to hide what she felt, who had been taught, through repetition or consequence, that showing emotion was not safe. But it was the hands that provided the most disturbing clue. In the original photograph, Eliza May's hands appeared neatly folded in her lap, a picture of obedience and proper deportment. Children in formal portraits were often instructed to sit just this way, hands still, posture upright, as if they were miniature adults, rather than the restless, energetic creatures they naturally were. But under magnification, faint marks became visible along the wrist lines that suggested pressure, possibly from restraint. The marks were not bruises exactly, but discolorations, areas where the skin had been compressed repeatedly over time. They were the kind of marks that might be left by rope or cloth tied tightly, or hands gripping too hard. The skin around the knuckles was slightly discolored as well, a detail consistent with repeated bruising or scraping. One finger, the smallest on her left hand, appeared slightly bent, as if it had been broken and healed improperly, without medical attention. The nail on that finger was malformed, a sign that the injury had occurred during a crucial period of growth, damaging the nail bed permanently. A photography historian from the Library of Congress reviewed the scan and noted something else. Something that had nothing to do with the child herself, but with the circumstances of the photograph's creation. The lighting in the image was uneven. While the child's face was illuminated from the front, the left side of her body remained in shadow, an area of darkness that seemed deliberate. This was not typical of studio portraiture, where lighting was carefully controlled to flatter the subject, to minimize imperfections, and create a sense of warmth and presence. The shadow suggested either a rushed setup, where the photographer had not taken the time to adjust the lamps properly, or an attempt to obscure something perhaps bruising, or other marks on the child's arm or shoulder. Comparison images from the same era, taken in similar studios across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, showed none of these irregularities. Other children from the 1920s appeared calm, even joyful. Despite the long exposure times and the formality of the occasion, their eyes were clear, their postures relaxed, their hands resting naturally in their laps. Some smiled, though smiling was not yet common in formal portraiture. Others looked serious, but their seriousness was the seriousness of dignity. Not fear, but Eliza May's portrait stood apart. It was not a celebration of childhood. It was not a proud parent's record of their daughter's growth and beauty. It was something else entirely, a document of survival, perhaps, or a moment of visibility in a life otherwise hidden from view. A forensic psychologist consulted on the case, reviewed all the available materials, and offered an assessment that was both professional and deeply unsettling. The expression on Eliza May's face, she explained, was consistent with what clinicians call frozen watchfulness, a term used to describe the behavior of children who have been subjected to chronic abuse or neglect. These children learn to monitor their environment constantly, to read the moods and intentions of the adults around them, to suppress their own needs and emotions in order to avoid punishment. They become hypervigilant, always alert, always waiting for the next blow or the next deprivation. And when they are forced to sit still, to be photographed or examined, their faces take on this particular quality, a stillness that is not peace, but a kind of paralysis. A learned response to danger that cannot be escaped. The photograph in this reading was not a portrait at all. It was evidence. It was a record, preserved by accident or intent, of a child in distress. A child whose suffering had been visible to anyone willing to look closely enough. But no one had looked. Not the photographer, who might have been paid to take the picture and ask no questions. Not the studio staff, if there were any, who might have seen dozens of children each week and learned to ignore the signs. Not the neighbors, if there were any who noticed. And certainly not the authorities, who in 1924 had neither the resources nor the mandate to intervene in family matters except in the most extreme cases. Eliza May had been photographed, documented, and then forgotten. And the photograph had survived, outlasting everyone who might have told her story, carrying its silent testimony through the decades until someone finally stopped to listen. Millbrook Lane no longer resembled the street it had been in 1924. The mill that gave the town its name had closed in 1957, its looms silent, its windows shattered, its brick walls slowly crumbling under the weight of abandonment and weather. The workers' homes that had once lined the street, narrow structures, built quickly and cheaply to house the men and women who fed the mill's insatiable appetite for labor, had fallen into disrepair or been demolished entirely. Empty lots marked the places where families had lived, raised children, argued and laughed and died. The few buildings that remained stood like tombstones, marking the passage of a community that no longer existed. But number 14 still stood. It was a narrow two-story structure with peeling paint and boarded windows, its front porch sagging under years of neglect. The roof was missing shingles, the gutters clogged with leaves and debris. The yard, if it could be called that, was overgrown, with weeds and wild grass, the kind of tangled vegetation that thrives in places where human attention has been withdrawn. Mrs. Calloway, the current owner, no longer lived there full-time. She had moved to a smaller house closer to the center of town, a place with better plumbing and heat, leaving the old house to stand empty except for the occasional visit to check for leaks or vandalism. When Thomas Brennan arrived to inspect the property, Mrs. Calloway met him at the door with a key and a warning. She was a small woman, bent slightly with age, her hands spotted and trembling as she pressed the key into his palm. "Ow!" She did not look at the house as she spoke, as if even the sight of it carried some weight she preferred to avoid. "I don't go upstairs anymore," she said quietly. "Not since I found the letters." Brennan asked her to explain. Mrs. Calloway hesitated, glancing back at her car as if considering whether to simply leave, to hand over the key and let him discover whatever he was going to discover on his own. But she stayed, and after a long silence, she told him the story. She had bought the house in 1978, drawn by the low price and the promise of space. a place where she could raise her children away from the noise and expense of the city. The house had been empty for years, and the previous owner, an elderly man who had inherited it from his parents, had been eager to sell. He had mentioned almost casually that there was a room upstairs that no one used, a room that had been kept locked for as long as he could remember. He said it as if it were a quirk, an eccentricity, nothing more. But there was something in his voice, a hesitation, that made Mrs. Calloway wonder what he was not saying. For the first few years she had respected the unspoken rule. She had cleaned every other room, painted the walls, replaced the floors, but the door to that room had remained closed, its lock rusted shut. Her children, when they were young, had asked about it, curious as children are about forbidden spaces. But she had told them it was storage, nothing interesting, and eventually they had stopped asking. Then, one winter afternoon, in 1983, the ceiling in the hallway had started to leak. Water was seeping through from somewhere above, staining the plaster and dripping onto the floor. Mrs. Calloway had gone upstairs with a bucket and a flashlight, checking each room for the source of the leak. When she reached the locked room, she realized the water was coming from inside. She had no choice. She forced the lock, the old metal giving way with a crack, and pushed the door open. The smell hit her first stale air, dust, and something else, something faint and sour that made her stomach turn. The room was small, barely large enough for a single bed and a dresser. The wallpaper was yellowed and peeling, the floor covered in a layer of grime. The window, though intact, was nailed shut from the outside. The wood around the frame warped and splintered. There was no furniture, no sign that anyone had lived there in decades. But in one corner, beneath a loose floorboard, she found a bundle of papers tied with a piece of string. The papers were letters, written in a child's handwriting, small and uneven, on scraps torn from school notebooks. Most were addressed to no one in particular. Some were prayers, others were pleas. Please let me go outside. Please let me have supper. Please don't lock the door again. I promise I'll be good. The letters were undated. The paper and ink were old, consistent with the 1920s or early 1930s. Mrs. Calloway had shown them to a local minister, hoping for some explanation, some reassurance that they were not what they seemed to be. The minister had read them carefully, his face growing more troubled with each page. When he finished, he had folded them gently and handed them back. These were written by a child who was suffering, he said, a child who was alone and afraid. He had advised her to leave the room as it was, to close the door and not disturb it again. Some things, he said, were better left undisturbed. Some histories were too painful to unearth. Mrs. Calloway had followed his advice. She had nailed the door shut, covered the entrance with a bookshelf, and tried to forget what she had found. But she had never forgotten. And now, more than 30 years later, she was handing the key to a stranger, asking him to finish what she had been unable to do. Brennan climbed the narrow staircase, the wood creaking under his weight. The air was cold and stale, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with absence, the withdrawal of life and warmth, he found. The door, easily it, was the only one that looked different. Newer wood nailed over the frame, a clumsy attempt to seal it permanently. He pried the boards away carefully, mindful of the age of the structure, and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as Mrs. Calloway had described it, small, empty, oppressive in its silence. Brennan examined the room methodically, photographing every detail. The wallpaper, yellowed and peeling, bore faint marks along one wall, scratches, as if made by small fingers, lines that ran vertically from waist height to just above the baseboard. The window, though broken now, its glass long since shattered, showed clear signs of having been nailed shut from the outside. The nails were still there, rusted and bent, driven deep into the frame. The door, too, showed signs of modification. The lock was old, the kind that could only be opened from the hallway, and there were scratches around the keyhole, marks that suggested repeated attempts to pick or force it open from the inside. In the closet, beneath a pile of rotted fabric that might once have been clothing or bedding, Brennan found a single child's shoe. It was small, worn through at the toe, the leather cracked and stiff with age. On the inside, written in faded ink, was a name, E. M. Brennan stood in the center of the room for a long time, the shoe in his hand, trying to imagine what it had been like for a child to live here. To be locked in this small, cold space, day after day, night after night. The room had no heat source, no light except what came through the nailed window. It was a prison, crude and effective, and it had held a child whose only crime, as far as anyone could determine, was existing. The house had kept its secrets for nearly a century, but now, slowly, painfully, they were beginning to surface. And with each new discovery, the photograph of Eliza May took on a deeper significance. Not just as a portrait, but as evidence of a life that had been deliberately hidden, suffering that no one had been willing to acknowledge. Eliza May appeared in the 1920 census as a 1-year-old child living with her parents, Jonathan and Ruth, and her older brother, James, at 14 Millbrook Lane in Riverton, Pennsylvania. The entry was brief, the information minimal: names, ages, occupations, place of birth. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that would have drawn attention or raised questions. It was a record like millions of others, a snapshot of a family at a particular moment in time. She appeared again in the church baptism record in March 1924, her name written in careful script in the ledger of the Riverton Presbyterian Church. The entry noted her parents' names and the address, confirming that the family was still living at the same location. But after that, the trail went cold. There was no school enrollment record for Eliza May in any of the local districts. No attendance records. No report cards. No mention of her in any school census or teacher's log. Thomas Brennan expanded his search. Looking for any trace of the child beyond 1924, he checked medical records, hospital admissions, clinic logs. Nothing. He searched death records, burial registries, obituaries. Nothing. He contacted the Pennsylvania State Archives, requesting any documents related to child welfare, orphanage admissions, or asylum records that might mention a child named Eliza May. Again, nothing. By 1930, not only had Eliza May disappeared from the records, but her entire family had vanished as well. The census that year, which should have listed the family at 14 Millbrook Lane, or at a new address if they had moved, contained no mention of Jonathan, Ruth, James, or Eliza May. The house at 14 Millbrook Lane was listed as occupied by a different family entirely. A mill worker named Henry Dobbs and his wife. With no children, Brennan found this pattern deeply troubling. Individual disappearances from records were not uncommon, especially for women and children, whose lives were often less thoroughly documented than those of men. But for an entire family to vanish, leaving no trace in any official record, suggested something more deliberate. It suggested a family that had either changed its name, moved far away without notifying authorities, or simply ceased to exist in any legal or social. SENSEA historian, specializing in early 20th century child welfare, reviewed Brennan's findings and offered context that was both illuminating and disturbing. Before the establishment of robust child protection laws in the mid-20th century, children lived at the mercy of their parents and guardians, with little oversight or intervention from the state. Abuse, neglect, and exploitation were common, but they were rarely documented or prosecuted. Teachers might notice bruises or absences, but they had no legal obligation to report their suspicions, and most chose not to, either out of respect for family privacy or fear of community backlash. Children died young or sometimes buried without formal records, especially in rural areas or among impoverished families who could not afford cemetery plots or tombstones. Home burials were legal in many states, and it was not unusual for a child to be interred on family property with no official death certificate, no obituary, no marker beyond a rough wooden cross that would rot away within a generation, but the absence of any documentation at all. No death record, no burial, no mention in family letters or local newspapers suggested something even darker. It suggested that Eliza May's disappearance had been deliberately concealed, that her family, or someone within it, had taken steps to ensure that no questions would be asked, no investigations launched, no uncomfortable truths brought to light. Brennan contacted descendants of families who had lived on Millbrook Lane during the 1920s, hoping that someone might remember the family at number 14, might have heard stories passed down through generations, Most had no memory of the family at all. The name meant nothing to them. But one elderly woman, the granddaughter of a family that had lived 3 houses down from the boarding house, responded to his inquiry with a brief but chilling email. "My grandmother mentioned a family that lived in the boarding house when she was young," the woman wrote. "She said there was a little girl who used to watch from an upstairs window. My grandmother remembered her because she never saw her outside, not even in summer when all the other children were playing in the street. She said the girl always looked sad, and once, when my grandmother waved to her, the girl didn't wave back. She just stared." The woman added that her grandmother had once asked her own mother about the girl, but her mother had told her not to talk about it, that it wasn't any of their business what happened in other people's homes. That was the end of the conversation. The subject was never raised again. This pattern of silenced neighbors who noticed but said nothing. Family members who knew but did not act. Community that chose to look away was tragically common in cases of child abuse during this era. Intervention was rare, and when it did occur, it was usually because a teacher, doctor, or clergy member took it upon themselves to involve authorities, often at great personal and professional risk. But no such intervention had occurred for Eliza May. No one had spoken up. No one had asked questions. And by the time anyone might have wondered what had become of the little girl in the window, the family had vanished, and with them, any hope of answers. Brennan began to suspect that Eliza May had died in that house, possibly in that room, and that her death had been covered up. Her body disposed of in a way that left no record. It was a grim conclusion, but it was the only one that fit the evidence. The photograph, taken in 1924, might have been one of the last images of her alive. And if that was true, then the tension in her face, the fear in her eyes, the marks on her wrists, all of it took on a new and terrible significance. The photograph was not just a portrait, it was a witness. The only witness that had survived. The more Thomas Brennan learned about Eliza May and her family, the clearer it became that what had happened to her was not an isolated incident of parental cruelty, but part of a larger pattern of neglect and abuse that was disturbingly common in early 20th century America, particularly among impoverished and working-class families. Child welfare laws, in 1924, were minimal and poorly enforced. The first juvenile court in the United States had been established in Chicago in 1899, marking a shift toward viewing children as distinct from adults in the eyes of the law. But the protections afforded by these early reforms were limited and unevenly applied. In many states, parents retained nearly absolute authority over their children, and the threshold for state intervention was extraordinarily high. A child had to be visibly and severely abused, neglected to the point of starvation, or engaged in criminal behavior before authorities would consider removing them from their home, even when abuse was suspected. The process of investigation and intervention was cumbersome and often ineffective. Social workers were few, resources scarce, and the prevailing attitude among both officials and the general public was that family matters should remain private. The phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child" was not just a saying but a widely accepted philosophy of child rearing, one that justified physical punishment and harsh discipline as necessary for moral development. In this environment, a child like Eliza May, fined to a room, denied schooling, isolated from her peers, could suffer for years without attracting official attention. Her neighbors might have noticed her face in the window, might have wondered why she never played outside, but the social norms of the time discouraged them from asking questions or intervening. To do so would have been seen as intrusive, as a violation of the family's privacy and autonomy. The photograph itself, viewed through this historical lens, became even more troubling. It was taken at a professional studio, which meant that the family had left the house, traveled to the photographer's location, and sat for a formal portrait. This was not a casual snapshot taken at home, but a deliberate act, one that required planning and expense. Why, then, had the family chosen to have Eliza May photographed? Was it a gesture of normalcy, an attempt to present themselves as a respectable family, despite what was happening behind closed doors? Or was it something else, a record commissioned by someone outside the family, perhaps a relative or social worker who suspected abuse and wanted documentation? The absence of a studio mark on the photograph suggested that it might not have been a standard commercial portrait. Professional photographers typically stamped or embossed their work, both as advertising and as proof of authorship. The lack of such a mark raised the possibility that the photograph had been taken by an amateur, or that the studio mark had been deliberately removed or obscured. A forensic psychologist who reviewed the case offered another possibility. The photograph, she suggested, might have been taken by the parents themselves, or at their request, as a form of control or coercion. In some cases of severe abuse, perpetrators document their actions, either as a way to relive and reinforce their power over the victim or as a means of intimidation. The act of photographing Elisa May, forcing her to sit still, to dress in her best clothes, to present a facade of normalcy might have been an extension of the control exerted over her in every other aspect of her life. Asterisk, whatever the intent. The photograph had preserved evidence that would otherwise have been lost. The marks on her wrists, the tension in her face, the shadow that obscured part of her body, all of these details, invisible or easily dismissed at the time, became crucial pieces of evidence when examined decades later with the tools and knowledge of modern forensic analysis. The letters found in the room added another layer of testimony. Written in a child's hand, they spoke of hunger, isolation, and fear. They were not accusations. Exactly, Elisa May never named her abusers or described specific acts of violence. But they were pleas, desperate and repetitive. The kind of writing that children produce when they have no other outlet for their suffering. Please let me go outside, please. Let me have supper. Please don't lock the door. Again, these were not the words of a child who was occasionally disciplined or temporarily confined. They were the words of a child who lived in a state of chronic deprivation and fear, whose existence had been reduced to a cycle of confinement, punishment, and brief conditional release, as the shoe found in the closet, worn through at the toe. Too small for a child who should have been growing, marked with her initials, offered physical evidence of neglect. Children's shoes in the 1920s were expensive, and most families bought them sparingly, expecting each pair to last as long as possible. But a shoe worn to the point of disintegration, with the leather cracked and the sole nearly gone, suggested a child who had been wearing it far beyond its useful life, whose parents either could not or would not provide her with new shoes. Taken together, the photograph, the letters, and the shoe formed a coherent narrative of abuse and neglect. Elisa May had been confined to a small room, denied adequate food and clothing, and isolated from her peers and the outside world. The photograph, likely taken in early 1924, captured her in a moment of forced visibility, a brief emergence from the hidden life she had been forced to lead, and then, shortly afterward, she vanished from all records, suggesting that whatever suffering she had endured in that room had reached its inevitable, tragic conclusion. Asterisk, finding living descendants of Elisa May's family proved extraordinarily difficult. The family's disappearance from official records after 1924 meant that there was no clear trail to follow. No subsequent generations listed in census data or property records. But Thomas Brennan persisted, tracing the family backward through earlier census records, identifying siblings of Jonathan and Ruth, and tracking their descendants through marriage records, obituaries, and genealogical databases. After months of searching, he located a woman living in rural Ohio who identified herself as the great-niece of Ruth, Elisa May's mother. The woman, who asked to remain anonymous out of concern for her privacy and that of her children, was initially reluctant to speak about the family. She had grown up hearing whispers and fragments of stories, references to a troubled branch of the family tree that no one wanted to discuss in detail. When Brennan explained the nature of his research and shared the photograph, the woman went silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and hesitant, as if she were breaking a taboo that had been enforced for generations. She said her grandmother Ruth's younger sister had rarely spoken about Ruth's family. But on one occasion, late in her life, she had mentioned Elisa May. The grandmother had been in her 80s then, her memory failing, her inhibitions loosened by age and medication. She had been looking through old family photographs when she suddenly stopped, staring at a picture of Ruth taken before her marriage. She had a little girl, the grandmother had said abruptly, a little girl who disappeared. When pressed for details, the grandmother had become agitated, insisting that it was not something to be discussed, that it was old history, best forgotten. But she had added one more thing, almost as an afterthought. Jonathan was a violent man, she said. Ruth was too afraid to leave him, and the boy James E. ran away when he was 16. He was smart to run. The great-niece had never forgotten that conversation, but she had never pursued it either. It was family lore, dark and vague, the kind of story that circulated in whispers, but was never examined too closely. She had assumed, if she thought about it at all, that Eliza May had died of illness or accident, that the disappearance was a euphemism for a death that had been too painful to discuss openly. But now, looking at the photograph Brennan had sent her, she began to wonder if the truth was worse than she had imagined. The child's face, the tension and fear, so visible once you knew to look for them, suggested something more deliberate than illness or accident. Brennan asked if she knew what had become of Jonathan and Ruth, or if there were any records of where the family had gone after leaving Riverton. The woman said she knew nothing concrete, only more fragments. There was a story, passed down through the family, that Jonathan had died in the early 1930s, possibly from an industrial accident. Though no one had ever seen a death certificate or knew where he was buried, Ruth, according to the same vague family lore, had moved west, possibly to Ohio or Indiana, and had died sometime in the 1940s. Again, with no clear record of when or where. As for James, the older brother, the woman knew even less. He had severed all ties with the family after running away, and no one had heard from him again. It was possible he had changed his name, started a new life far from the violence and dysfunction of his childhood. Or it was possible he had died young, another casualty of poverty and instability, his death unrecorded and unmarked. The great-niece offered one final piece of information, something her grandmother had said during that same late-life conversation. When she had mentioned Eliza May, when she had said the little girl had disappeared, she had added almost in a whisper, for words that had stayed with the great-niece ever since. They said it was mercy. The woman did not know what that meant. Mercy for whom? Mercy from what? But the phrase had haunted her, and now, hearing about the photograph, about the room, about the letters, she understood it in a new and terrible way. It was not mercy. It was concealment. It was the word the family had used to make themselves feel better about what had happened. To transform an act of violence or neglect into something almost noble, something that could be spoken of, if it had to be spoken of at all, without shame. But Eliza May had deserved more than mercy. She had deserved protection. She had deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be saved. And she had received none of those things. All that remained of her was a photograph, a handful of letters, and a worn-out shoe with her initials written inside. The photograph of Eliza May remains in Claire Hastings' possession, though she has donated a high-resolution scan to the National Archives and organizations dedicated to child abuse prevention. It has become part of a collection documenting the hidden lives of children in early 20th century America, lives lived in silence and suffering. For Claire, the photograph is no longer a collectible. It has become a testament, a witness, voice for a child who had none. The investigation has not produced definitive answers. There is no death certificate, no burial record, no confession. But what has been uncovered paints a picture of profound suffering and systemic failure, a case where every adult who might have intervened chose to look away. The photograph itself reveals layers of meaning invisible to those who first saw it. The child's expression, the marks on her wrists, the deliberate shadow these details speak volumes to those trained to read them. Forensic psychologists note that images like this are valuable as teaching tools. They show how abuse can hide in plain sight, how children learn to mask suffering, how communities fail to protect the vulnerable. The letters found in the room have been archived. They are heartbreaking in their simplicity. A child who learned her words had no power, but wrote them anyway. Please let me go outside. Please let me have supper. Please don't lock the door again. The shoe has been preserved. A reminder that behind every historical statistic is a human life. A child who wore out her shoes and looked out a window, waiting for someone to see her. For those who worked on this case, the experience has been rewarding and troubling. Rewarding to give voice to the voiceless. Troubling to realize how common such cases were, how many stories remain untold. When we look at old photographs, we see what was intended: smiling faces, formal poses, respectability, but sometimes if we look closely, we see the truth beneath. We see tension, fear, marks that no posing can conceal, and once seen, cannot be unseen. The photograph of Elisa May asks questions without words. Her face, frozen in 1924, looks out with an expression both accusation and plea. She asks to be seen, truly seen, not as a quaint relic, but as a child who lived, suffered, and deserved better. Now, a century later, we finally see her. We acknowledge what happened. We say her name, Elisa May. Born 1919, photographed 1924, disappeared without trace, erased from every record except this one fragile image. She existed. She mattered. And her photograph has finally found its purpose. It has become evidence. It has become testimony. It has become, at last, the voice she never had.